Recording is resumed and the webinar has started. And Satya, over to you.
Thank you, Nina. Welcome, colleagues, to a very significantly important, and I'll explain why, Nexus Dialogue on unpacking linkages with gender and biodiversity in the UN system efforts. And it is significantly important because while we all speak in one voice as a UN system to the rest of the world, but many a times it might be seen for the untrained eye as disjointed or uncoordinated. And often donors come back and tell us that sometimes we are not really coordinated in critical matters such as gender and biodiversity. And of course, the work of the Environment Management Group that concluded recently, and a report will be published soon in terms of how we are doing on biodiversity. And of course, gender has been in focus thanks to UN Women and all the amazing work colleagues at UN Women and the gender focal points in literally every UN system, agency, fund, and program are doing. But biodiversity is something that's in focus, particularly this year, in view of all the recent challenges in terms of the studies and reports that have come out telling us that we are running the risk of losing 1 million of the 8 million species that inhabit the planet, and that we need to do more. And the time couldn't be more urgent in the context of what the UN system needs to do. And also 2020 was intended to be groundbreaking for gender equality as well, marking the 25th anniversary of the Beijing Platform for Action. But unfortunately, COVID-19 has had disproportionate negative impacts on women, and it seriously risks rolling back the limited gains that have made in recent decades by the world community, and further enhancing the fault lines and deepening pre-existing inequalities. And then, of course, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the 2050 Vision for Biodiversity of Living in Harmony with Nature commits to leaving no one behind, and therefore necessitating that gender mainstreaming as set out in the SDGs, so that it is reflected and advanced in the efforts by member states and stakeholders to halt biodiversity loss. And the Secretary General has highlighted the need to focus on people and the most vulnerable in particular, and he's emphasized it repeatedly that women and girls should be put at the center of efforts to recover from COVID-19. So this particular Nexus Dialogue will build on unpacking linkages with gender and biodiversity in the UN system efforts, providing an overview of priority objectives to address persistent gender and biodiversity challenges and their linkages with the broader environmental and sustainable development agenda. And then, of course, at the EMG, we intend to convene and engage the entire UN system behind rights-based environmental action with a focus on addressing issues of gender equality in the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity, including the fair and equitable sharing of benefits. And in doing so, we will consider how synergies among UN system efforts can be maximized to contribute to the development and implementation of CBD's Gender Plan of Action and the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, which will be agreed to by the member states in Kunming in a few months' time. So a very warm welcome to today's Nexus Dialogue, and thank you, esteemed colleagues, for your expert perspectives. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Satya, for the introduction. My name is Ben Schachter. I lead the work on environment and climate change at the UN Human Rights Office. And I'll be the moderator for today's discussion, which I'm very pleased to be doing. And let me just get right started so we can hear from our panelists soon. I do want to say a few words from the perspective of the UN Human Rights Office in Geneva, or all around the world, but I'm based here in Geneva. It's a great pleasure, as I said, to contribute to today's discussion on unpacking linkages with gender and biodiversity and UN system efforts. We have seen, you know, in the UN Human Rights Office, that after years of working on climate change and environment, it's really time that we start digging in and doing more on biodiversity. And the linkages between, in particular, climate change and the area we're talking about here today, biodiversity, are very clear. And those linkages brought us, after several years of focusing really on the human rights impacts of climate change, producing a series of studies, including a study on climate change and its impacts on gender equality, to give a closer look to biodiversity and the fact that when nature loses, you know, it's humanity and women and girls who are particularly affected. So biodiversity is necessary for ecosystem services that support the full enjoyment of a wide range of human rights, including the rights to life, health, food, water, and culture. And any effort aimed at ending biodiversity and habitat loss thereby will also contribute to preventing human rights violations, and in particular, the violation of the rights of women and girls, who are often at the forefront of suffering adverse impacts. Biodiversity loss, we know, may disproportionately harm the rights of women and girls, and it can also have intersectional impacts when women and girls are parts of groups or peoples subject to exclusion and discrimination. But we also know that women and girls are critical to unlocking a future in which both people and planet can thrive. And, you know, the world has a long way to go to make sure that women equally and meaningfully participate in biodiversity policymaking and the equitable distribution of the benefits of its results. So that's why we're here today. I think Sasha already raised the 2030 agenda. It illustrates the interconnectedness between gender, biodiversity, and other elements of the human right to a healthy environment, including a non-toxic environment and safe and stable climate. And it's really important we consider gender perspectives in this context. And gender equality, of course, is a dedicated SDG. So that's what I mean when I say it's bringing together different key elements in one holistic framework. So gender equality is a goal in itself, as well as a foundation for successful action. So once we look at and think about these issues, and that's what the Nexus Dialogue space is for in a holistic context, we come up with some interesting ideas and results. And I'm really looking forward to hearing from the panelists. So I won't say a whole lot more, but I just want to flag that, you know, the work we're doing, looking at safe and stable climate, non-toxic environment, participation, access to information, and access to justice in environmental matters, and protecting biodiversity all comes together under the framework of advancing the human right to a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, which has been identified as a priority by the Secretary General's Call to Action for Human Rights and by the High Commissioner for Human Rights. And that work is threatened by a number of obstacles, including COVID-19, which has highlighted how dependent we are on nature even more, but also unfortunately resulted in the postponement of a number of critical meetings last year which were intended to step up ambition, including, of course, CBD Cup 15, which would be the space for negotiations of the post-2020 global biodiversity framework, as well as new gender program of action under the CBD aligned with that new framework. And we really can't see these two things as separate, because the post-2020 global biodiversity framework will not succeed unless it moves to ensure women's rights and gender equality. And so I'm very excited to hear from our panelists. I hope today's dialogue will contribute to shed light on how the UN can best promote gender inclusive biodiversity governance, and look very much forward to hearing more from today's panelists about how they see the way forward to get there. So with that said, I will turn things over to our first panelist, who is Tanya McGregor. She's a gender program officer from the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity. And she'll be sharing with us some initial remarks about gendered approaches to biodiversity and environmental governance from the perspective of the Secretariat. And she'll have 5 minutes for that. Over to you, Tanya.
Thanks very much, Ben. And my thanks also to the EMG for organizing this Nexus Dialogue. It's great to have you all here today to share views and discuss opportunities for advancing gender responsive biodiversity action, particularly, as Ben said, as we are at an important time in the convention. With the development of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework and a new post-2020 Gender Plan of Action, there's a real opportunity right now to set forward ambitious objectives for biodiversity and for gender equality. So I wanted to give some context on addressing gender in the CBD. I think it's useful to give a bit of a history and a retrospective of how things have developed. As you may know, the preamble of the CBD put a focus on the need for full participation of women at all levels of policymaking and implementation in regards to biodiversity. Decisions under the CBD have continued to highlight the participation of women and the importance of taking into account their needs in respect to achieving the 3 objectives of the convention. Now, moving from the establishment of the CBD in 1993 to the most recent Gender Plan of Action, which was the 2015-2020 Gender Plan, possible objectives that were put forward for parties included, most notably, to integrate gender in the development and implementation of national biodiversity strategies and action plans. And some related objectives included ensuring the full participation of women and men in implementing the CBD, and considering the different needs of women and men in designing and undertaking actions for the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. So what I want to highlight here is that a lot of the focus, at least in the formal decisions of the CBD, has been on the means through which gender issues should be addressed, or the areas in which to do so. And while this is an important part of a gender responsive process, it doesn't necessarily clarify the intended results. A focus on women's participation, for example, can obscure what is meant to be achieved by them being in the room or at the table. This has made it difficult to measure progress in some ways in terms of action on the plan, as it is more difficult to determine if we're really getting to where we need to go without clear benchmarks in place. So the draft outline of the post-2020 Gender Plan of Action and its current formulation includes a set of 3 overarching goals or priorities that are intended to describe the results to be achieved in order to ensure effective gender responsive implementation of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. So the first priority or results area identified is for women's equal access, ownership, and control in relation to biodiversity and ecosystem services. And this is directly aligned with SDG Target 5.A, recognizing that rights to land and land tenure are closely linked to women's ability to invest in sustainable management practices, and as well as being key in supporting their economic empowerment. The second priority or results area is to ensure women benefit equally from efforts to conserve and sustainably manage biodiversity. This includes benefiting from employment opportunities in biodiversity-related supply chains, sectors, and initiatives, including opportunities associated with the establishment of protected areas. Again, this recognizes that socioeconomic benefits from the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity must be equitably shared in order for these initiatives to be successful over the long term. And the third priority area identified is for biodiversity policy, planning, and programming decisions to address equally the perspectives, interests, and needs of women and girls, and to ensure that decisions on biodiversity reflect the needs and interests of women and girls, as well as men and boys, necessitates an inclusive and equitable decision-making process, one in which women are able to participate effectively and equally to men. This is again closely aligned with SDG targets under Goals 5 and Goals 16. These results areas are complemented in the draft outline for the plan by a series of implementation and review mechanisms, which address in more detail the type of means required to support the achievement of these proposed priorities. Together, these results areas and implementation mechanisms are proposed as a basis for spurring transformative action, transformative change for biodiversity that is both sustainable and equitable. So in summary, I would stress that looking at the gendered elements of the CBD has brought us towards focusing more directly on the desired results, together with the means necessary to achieve them in order to move the needle forward for gender and for biodiversity. So I will leave it there for now, and I will give back to you, Ben. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Tanya, for those initial remarks, and I'll look forward to digging in a little deeper on them when we get to the question and answer session. And just to remind everybody online following, you're welcome to share questions in the chat, in the Q&A of the Zoom at any point, and we'll come to those further on. That said, our next panelist is Miss Gabriella Richardson from the Richardson TAM, gender specialist with the Global Environment Facility. And Gabriella, I invite you to share with us some initial thoughts on gendered approaches to biodiversity and environmental governance. Over.
Yes. Thank you so much, and good morning, good afternoon to everyone, or wherever you are. Very honored to be here today, and I know that Nina is going to try to share. I have a quick presentation, mainly to something to lend your eyes on as I talk today. So I wait until Nina has put it up. Yeah. So just to start then, to introduce myself, I am Gabriella Richardson Tam. I work with the GEF, where I lead the Global Environmental Facility, where I lead work on gender equality, as well as on environmental and social safeguards. So just for those of you, and I will not go in, of course, to any details here, for those of you that are joining and don't know so much about the GEF, the GEF is a financial mechanism to 5 different environmental conventions or agreements, including the CBD, but also the UNFCCC and the Convention on Land Degradation, as well as in the Stockholm Convention and the Minamata Convention. So we work across a broader range of organizations. We receive most of our guidance on how we operate and program from the conventions. And we, as you might know, we are in the process of initiating our new replenishment period, moving into GEF 8. And this is an important time where we receive a lot of guidance from the conventions. So we can move on, and I just wanted to put that as a underlying basis for the conversation. So as you actually already have heard, and Tanya very nicely outlined the objectives or the priority settings of the Gender Action Plan. And I'm just going to quickly go into them a little bit in more detail, because I think these are really the areas that we have to think about as institutions as we move forward. We do know, even though that there has been a lot of progress, both at national level, but also at international level, to address gender issues. And we're seeing changes at the national level with improved laws and processes and procedures. But we still know, and even with the new information that comes, even though that it might in some cases, we don't have enough data, but we do know that women and men have different access to land, to access and control to natural resources, whether those are biodiversity resources and other ecosystem services. And this is really impacting, as Tanya outlined, it impacts women's ability to support their families, their communities, but also their ability to effectively manage environmental resources and adopting new technologies and practices. So we know that this is an important area that we have to address. The other issue that also Tanya mentioned that happy to see in the Gender Action Plan is the issues around environmental decision-making. And we know that across the board that women are getting a greater decision-making in many public institutions, but we do know that within the environmental sector, women's participation or opportunity to be part of the governance is lower, and there are many reasons behind these. And I think some of the thoughts that I hopefully that we can discuss later is, it's not, and I was happy to hear Tanya talk about it, it's not just about participation here, it's about effective participation and effective and meaningful participation. You actually have the ability to make decisions. And I think in many ways, even though you have procedures in place, there are norms and cultures that constrain women from effectively participate. Then the other area that we do know already is that women tend to receive less socioeconomic benefits and services from projects and international financing. And this is also a very important area. And just to let you know, I mean, as we see, these areas have been reflected in one way or another, both in the SDGs and the Agenda 2030. And I'll go in a little bit later. We have also incorporated that in the GEF implementation, gender implementation strategy. It's also something that we see reinforced in the other Rio Convention, and I'm happy to see that Fleur is here to join us. And also recently we see these areas being incorporated by new global assessments like the IPES, the IPCC, and others. So we need to build on the information that is coming from these global assessments. You can move to the next one. And I know that I only have 5 minutes, so I'll try to be quick. So just a little quick background on the GEF. As I said, we serve as a financial mechanism to many of the conventions. And we have listening, of course, to what is happening outside our own institution on gender, that we reshaped our approach to gender. In 2017, our council adopted a new policy on gender that really starts to think about how the GEF can better address gender, not just to mainstream it in our projects, but to really make sure that we have the mechanism and instruments in place to ensure that women have the equal opportunity to participate, contribute, and benefit from GEF financed activities. We have strengthened our project guidelines or project requirements across the project cycle. We are requiring things like a gender analysis before the project moves on to implementation. We are requiring gender indicators and other things. So we are really started to do that. We can move into the next slide just for time. So what we are seeing already is just the work that we put in together with, of course, our agencies, and I should have mentioned that we operate with 18 agencies, UN organizations, as well as NGOs are participating to implement the GEF projects. But what we are seeing so far in the GEF 7, when we change sort of our approach to gender, we are seeing that gender is more and more included in early project design. We're seeing good expected results on the areas that I discussed. For example, the issues on projects are trying to contribute to more equal access and control of net resources. We have a high level of projects that are expecting to contribute to women's improved participation. And we also have a high level of projects that are looking to target women in terms of their socioeconomic benefits. You can move to the next slide, which I suppose is my last. Yeah, so I was just thinking to conclude, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. Clearly, as Ben outlined, we are in a different place today than we were just a couple of years back. With the COVID-19 pandemic, we have seen a lot of changes, and women and girls have been more adversely impacted by the pandemic than other groups. And this is something that we have to really consider as we are thinking about a new frameworks on gender and biodiversity. But also we have to think about a little bit deeper that actually it is not just so simple of saying that, you know, we increase participation, we do this and that. It's a very complex system. So gender inequalities are embedded in a complex system related to the net resources. And as we're looking at actions and objectives and indicators, this is something that we have to take into account. The other area that I think is important is the issue that we are seeing that countries have improved the laws and policies around tenure and access to resources and control to resources. But in some places, and quite often, it's not enough that you have a policy change, but it really is that you have to address the underlying cultural norms in the society in order to really bring change. And then the other issue that I think Tanya mentioned is the issues of meaningful participation, that we have to go beyond counting men and women and to really look at women's role in net resource governance more broadly. Maybe concluding, we all know, and this is a big hindering factor, is the lack of data when it comes to disaggregated information on gender related to most of the environmental sectors. There's not a lot of investments. We are seeing more coming, but this is still something that is a problem for us. The other issues that are raised over and over is, of course, some governments don't have the capacity to address gender across environmental sectors. We could probably have the question whether it is lack of capacity or political priority, or what is the underlying issues why it's not happening. And I will just conclude that it is really important, and that's why I'm happy also to see that Fleur is here from Climate Convention, because this really is, we need to think about this in an integral and multi-dimensional framework, and not to look at that, we can have one interventions in one area, but we need to really coordinate. So I will end it with that. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gabriela, for those remarks, and already very clear focus from both you and Tanya on the importance of participation being meaningful and effective. And I expect we'll hear more on this from other panelists as well. Our next panelist is Ms. Seemin Qayum from the Economic Empowerment section of UN Women. Seemin, over to you.
Thank you so much, Ben, and greetings to all the panelists and organizers and participants in today's very important event. As Tanya and Gabriela have pointed out, we're at a critical juncture of momentous challenges and opportunities in terms of the mutual mainstreaming of gender and biodiversity to ensure women's full and equal participation in biodiversity conservation and sustainable use, and equal sharing of benefits in terms of both the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework and the United Nations Secretary General's Decade of Action on the Sustainable Development Goals. Tackling the gender drivers of environmental degradation, climate change, and biodiversity loss requires transforming patterns of production and consumption and dramatically reducing global dependency on fossil fuels based on an understanding of how gender and environment are mutually constitutive. It means significantly increasing financing for environment and sustainable development policies and investments with gender equality at their core. Taking a whole of government and a whole of society approach is essential for the sustainable use and management of biodiversity and conservation and protection of the environment that sustains the livelihoods and present and future well-being of all. Women's collective action for the environment, climate, and biodiversity, creating a more equal and sustainable present and future for all, has taken diverse and innovative forms. From calling for a new regenerative economy and a feminist global Green New Deal to a just transition towards biodiversity conservation and climate stabilization that encompasses decent work, quality jobs, and social protection for all in the care and green economies. Further, women's full participation, voice, and agency in decision-making at all levels on biodiversity, environment, and climate is an essential aspect of enabling their livelihoods, well-being, and resilience. Yet structural barriers and discriminatory social norms continue to constrain women's decision-making power in households and social and political participation in communities and more broadly. In a recent joint publication with OHCHR on women's land rights, just critical gender equality in conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity and equal sharing of benefits, we noted that 1, women in many rural communities hold expert knowledge of ecosystems and sustainable land management practices. Indigenous women often play an essential role in protecting biodiversity and sustaining knowledge about their lands and territories. 2, women's human rights, especially those of peasant and indigenous women, are undermined when they are excluded from meaningful participation in decision-making. And 3, in common with all human rights defenders, women defending these ecosystems face risks, including intimidation, criminalization, assault, and assassination, as well as the specific threat of gender-based violence. We would therefore suggest 3 criteria to assess whether policy actions and investments for biodiversity conservation and sustainable use adequately address gender equality. The first is, do they support women's capabilities and their enjoyment of rights? Second, do they reduce rather than increase women's unpaid care work? And 3, do they embrace women's equal and meaningful participation as actors, leaders, and decision makers? We know that some states have implemented quotas and other initiatives to increase women's participation across sectors. To promote women's participation in biodiversity conservation, some countries have called for protected area management boards and water committees to be composed of at least 40% women, and local planning and management committees for forest resources, for example, to contain 30% women, and gender parity in village natural resource management committees. But these efforts are still patchy and far from generalized. In the National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plans that parties prepare under the Convention on Biological Diversity, gender considerations have been integrated in multiple ways. But we only come up with maybe 14% of 174 countries, including women's empowerment and/or gender equality as a guiding principle. And 24% of most recent plans include at least one specific gender-related activity. 15% reference women as keepers of traditional ecological knowledge, as farmers, fishers, and indigenous elders. 24% refer to women as stewards of the environment, and only 4% consider women as agents of change. And few countries have the capacity and resources, and perhaps the political will, to collect, analyze, and disseminate sex disaggregated data and gender statistics on gender and environment. So how can we ensure accountability, that gender responsive biodiversity action plans are actually implemented, monitored, tracked, and enhanced on the basis of feedback and data, and so on? How can we avoid a ticking the gender box scenario? We would suggest that we must renew efforts to mainstream effectively both gender and biodiversity in national sustainable development frameworks, their governance, and their implementation. And in the interest of time, I'll stop there, but thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Seemin. And in particular, something I was remiss in not doing earlier, really emphasizing the need to address the situation of human rights defenders, including women's human rights defenders, because we can't possibly have progress if we live in a world that permits pernicious efforts to silence the voices of people standing up for their rights and for biodiversity. So just wanted to highlight that point among one of many really excellent remarks, and looking forward to also further kind of discussing the national biodiversity strategies and action plans and things like that. But before we move on to that, we have final panelist, Flor Newman, who's the gender advisor with the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. I've had the pleasure of working with Flor for several years, and looking forward to hearing what she has to say. Over to you, Flor.
Thank you very much. And the benefit of coming after all of my previous esteemed panelists is that I'm not going to go over the very many good points that have already been made, but hopefully to reinforce some of the messages. And, you know, I would start with this message around these being systems issues. Climate change is a system issue by systems responses, and biodiversity and ecosystem services are foundational elements of the issue that we're dealing with when we're dealing with climate change. And, you know, one of the messages, one of the ways in which we communicate about the link between gender and climate change is to identify that every anthropogenic greenhouse gas emission comes from a decision, a choice, an action, or an inaction of a human. And that's true also for human-caused biodiversity loss, yet not all humans are contributing or experiencing the impact of the impacts of climate change or the impacts of biodiversity loss equally. And in the case of climate change, what we've seen is that it exacerbates existing and creates new inequalities related to gender, as well as other multidimensional factors such as age and ethnicity, disability, and socioeconomic status. And that the differentiation with regards to gender occurs in at least three areas. And this was touched on a little bit by Gabriella earlier about, so these three areas include impacts and vulnerability. And women and girls are not inherently more vulnerable. It's the situations and the norms and the customs that create that vulnerability. And decision-making, so there's a differentiation in who gets to make the decisions on solutions and around responses to in the case of climate change, to immediate disasters, and also the benefits of solutions and responses. So in this case, you know, who's able to claim insurance after natural disasters or access finance or technical support for any of the positive actions that one can take. So there's this differentiation that happens, whether it's climate change or biodiversity. And addressing climate change and biodiversity loss requires a radical shift from business as usual. So, you know, when we're talking about countries seeking to transition to low carbon, climate resilient, and climate resilient means ensuring that our biodiversity is restored, and economies and societies, they must identify new ways of doing almost everything across their economies, and to do so in a just and fair way. And just as climate change threatens or will create disruption to many services and industries, so does this looming crisis of biodiversity loss. And that includes everything from tourism to agriculture and food systems to textile industries and our built environment. So, and that also includes financial services. So it's all connected, and a gender responsive approach to either climate or biodiversity also strengthens resilience, as it leads to the inclusion of the different capacities and experiences, expertise and perspectives possessed by women and men in adaptation initiatives. And I give an example here of one that I heard the other day about an irrigation system, which is that what happens when you don't do this. And it was an irrigation system that in which only the men in the community were consulted on the system, because the canal and the irrigation system was for productive purposes. But what it did was divert water away for the informal growing of crops and vegetables around houses, which was predominantly a female-led informal work. And they criminalized the extraction of water from this irrigation system, and also created a situation in which the food security and the nutritional value of the food that was available declined significantly in the community. So that's an example of what happens when you don't do this well. And this comes back to, if you don't take a gender responsive approach to analysing risk, and in this case, we're talking systemic risk, you're not taking a holistic and systematic approach to risk management. The link between gender responsive climate policy and has already been made. We have a decision on the 5-year enhanced Labour Work Programme on gender and its gender action plan. And it has priority areas that are similar to some of the things that we've already been talking about, which is no surprise because these have been identified as areas which are significant and important for us to be able to make progress. So that's around knowledge management, capacity building and communications, balance. So this is gender parity, but also in leadership and participation, coherence across the UNFCCC process, so looking at this as a systems issue, and also across the UN system, gender responsive climate finance, gender responsive means of implementation and actual implementation, so that's finance, capacity building and technology, and monitoring and reporting. And these are all areas in which if you can strengthen each one of those elements, you end up with a holistic approach to gender responsiveness, or gender transformation would be ideal. And one of the things I note is that capacity building appears twice within the priority areas under the UNFCCC action plan, because it's so critical. And we're talking here about ensuring that those who are gender specialists understand how their work relates to environmental issues, as well as much as making sure that those who are working on climate and environment understand how gender relates to their work. And we can talk about that a little bit more in our panel discussion later. But I would say that I would agree with some of the earlier points around coordination and collaboration and the need for us to be building on the successes that have already come before us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Flor, and to all of our wonderful panelists, also to our audience who's already actively engaging and sharing questions. Let me remind you to please go ahead and upvote the questions so we can prioritize them. Before we move on to the direct Q&A, we have a few questions that we'd like to ask our panelists to consider and further share insights about. And so I'll start with asking the panel if you can help us to identify key entry points to ensure equal access to biodiversity in ecosystem services, related benefits and decision-making in order to further gender equality and women's rights. And I'll be going back to Tanya to begin. I'll just ask you to be brief, so we will get to the audience's questions as well. So if you can aim for 2 minutes, that would be great. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ben. And thanks again to the panelists. It was a really interesting discussion of these issues to start. And I don't want to take up too much time, so I'll just jump into this more quickly. But I think one obvious entry point has been mentioned already, which is integrating gender into national biodiversity strategies and action plans, or NBSAPs, which are the principal instrument for implementing the convention at the national level. I would say that how to do this effectively is always the question, and the CBD Secretariat has done some work with a number of parties in supporting them to develop gender responsive NBSAPs. And I think that the takeaway from that is that this requires a lot of investment. It requires dedicated gender expertise to be engaged in the process of developing the plans and also supporting the implementation and reporting, in order that the actions that are proposed are thought through from a gender perspective, and there's adequate budget identified. What we've seen in the efforts to date to look at addressing gender in respect to NBSAPs is that there is some effort in that regard, but it is, as Seemin mentioned, rather patchy. It is not necessarily reflecting a full mainstreaming of issues across the full spectrum of identifying kind of the structure of the NBSAP, the activities, the budget, and then through the implementation and reporting. And so I would just add to that, again, picking up on another point that was mentioned earlier, of the need for a whole of government approach, which is also recognizing that NBSAPs need to be implemented in partnership with other leading ministries and entities within the national government structure. So it cannot just rest on the shoulders of ministries of environment and institutions responsible for biodiversity, but also needs to engage with ministries and machineries responsible for gender and women's affairs, as well as Ministry of Finance, Agriculture, Fisheries, and Health, and others. And I would just say that there's also opportunities to strengthen linkages with other policy imperatives, such as reporting on the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, or CEDAW, and the implementation of the Beijing Platform for Action. This can help, again, engage more with the national women's ministries and other institutions that are engaged in implementation and reporting on these conventions and this work. I mean, I could go on to say that there is also another.
Invite you to wrap up.
Okay, sorry. Maybe I'll leave it there and let others jump in on this one. Thanks. Bye.
Great, thank you so much, Tanya. And I think in particular on the NBSAP, we've also done some analysis looking for human rights in NBSAPs, and there's clearly a lot of room for improvement when it comes to human rights and gender equality integration. So that's something we need to look to. Turning things over now to Seemin, same question, key entry points. Over to you.
Thank you, Ben, and thank you, Tanya, for already covering the importance of gender mainstreaming, effective gender mainstreaming in the national biodiversity plans, and also the importance of bringing together ministries across sectors to ensure that gender and biodiversity considerations are incorporated in national planning and development strategies. And that includes not only the ministries of environment and gender, as you've mentioned, but also finance, agriculture, etc. I just want to point out a couple of other areas which I think are really, really important here. In terms of breaking down the silos that we have, not only in government between ministries, but in our own institutions, between those aspects that are working on, let's say, gender or environment or the economy or human rights, and bringing them together so that we have an integrated approach. And I find that in my own institution at UN Women, that those of us who are working on human rights aspects specifically, for example, as Tanya mentioned, supporting states to do their reporting under CEDAW, or in terms of the Beijing platform and platform for action, that we're not working hand in hand with those who are working on women's economic empowerment or ending violence against women and girls. And these aspects should all be integrated in our own institutions. That's really, really hard to do because it comes down to competition and rivalries for resources, for time, for energy, for attention, all of those things. But I think that this is something that we have to take on in our own work lives and in terms of the frameworks and governments that we're trying to support. And let me just stop there. Thank you. Oh, one other point that I think is really critical. Women's civil society organizations, be they gender advocates, human rights defenders, what have you, are allies here. And they are the ones that are going to make the difference in creating the political will and the political momentum within our institutions, within our governments, so that we can take this kind of action to mainstream both gender and biodiversity in a real way. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Seemin. And I'll move directly to you, Gabriela, for any thoughts.
Yeah, no, and thank you both, Seemin and Tanya. It's good to be third because a lot of things have already been mentioned and all my bullet points are already gone. So instead of just reiterating what you have already highlighted, I mean, I'll go into one additional thing that we haven't discussed, but yes, of course, as Tanya was really rightly pointing out, the addressing gender within the and BISAPs is an important, and I can see as we review Jeff projects coming in, we can see that there has been an addition, great improvement in terms of how these projects, this financing is actually addressing gender, so that you can see some improvements there. But and then also I just wanted to highlight the issue that Seemin was talking about, the importance of breaking the silos. And one of my point was really, it's not just breaking the silos and, you know, like you say, this ministry or another and having them to come together, but as what you were pointing out, Seemin, the importance of engaging women's organizations and these advocacy groups as well at the national level. I think one of the things that we have to consider if we're looking at, you know, even as a question is saying, how do we address, or what are the key entry points within biodiversity to, you know, improve women's access to biodiversity? You have to look at the totality or how the country looks like. It's not that you can address women's specific, you know, access to biodiversity resources. You have to look at the context in which, you know, what are women's situation in that country or in that context. And I think there, I want to highlight again, the importance of a gender analysis when we do any financing, and to really understanding those underlying barriers or cultural norms that is really limiting it. And I think in many ways, and I review a lot of these gender analysis, we still tend to, they are at a higher level without really looking at what are the barriers. And those barriers might be found not within sort of the interventions in biodiversity, they might be found somewhere else. And that's why I think that the breaking of the silos is really important. Let's see if I had anything else. Yeah, and I think—
I invite you to wrap up, please.
Well, then I'll leave it to Flora to come up with the next point. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Gabriela. And over to you, Flora.
Thank you. And yes, my bullet points are all gone, but I'm going to build on everybody else's because it's not just that we need to involve civil society organizations and women's associations and groups. We also need to ensure that they're funded. I mean, one of the challenges for these groups is often that they're working either on very little or no resources. And, you know, in order for them to actually be able to meaningfully engage, they need to be able to do that and support their families and have livelihoods. So there is also this element of support that is needed there, and whether that's done through different processes, you know, there are different innovative ways in which that could be done, but it's something that to just assume that we're going to be able to utilize the expertise that's within this without also ensuring that they have a means by which they can sustain their engagement is something that needs to be looked at. And in terms of the institutional frameworks for coordination, this was my point about we need to go beyond business as usual. It's not usual for government to work across ministries or to work vertically down to the local level, so from national to local. And so there is this shift that has to happen in terms of how we think about all of these issues and how the structures that can support that kind of coordination. It requires a deliberate, purpose-built coordination mechanism at a government level. And then I guess the other area is on leadership as well, and ensuring that attention is being paid also to, you know, when decisions are being made, it's not only from ministries, but it goes back to the point that you're not always going to be able to solve every issue by looking at every biodiversity gender issue, looking only at biodiversity aspects. We need to ensure that there is a shift also in more generally in leadership to be including women as well as men, and to ensure that people have the capacity to actually contribute to those leadership decisions. So having enabling environments within work conditions, and that's been highlighted through COVID-19 with the dropping out of women from the workforce in very large numbers as a result of the need to attend to schooling children and other care responsibilities, and that goes back
And
to
I invite you to wrap up.
Comment about social protection.
Great. Thank you all very much. We had a couple more questions we wanted to ask the panel to sort of frame this conversation. In the interest of time, I think I'm going to sort of combine those last two questions and ask you to really stick with 2 minutes so that we do get over to the great questions coming in the Q&A and chat. And you're also welcome, panelists, to respond to some of those questions in writing, and or if they relate to the question I'm about to ask you in the context of the question I'm about to ask you, which is essentially, there were two things we wanted to look at. One is where the UN can make the biggest difference in supporting policy planning and programming to integrate perspective, interests, and needs of women and girls and biodiversity action. And the other was to identify gaps. And I think they're probably in many cases the same. So I'd like you to think, you know, where is it we can make an impact, and also where are the gaps, the major gaps that need to be addressed. And sometimes the impact might actually be just doing more in an area we're already working. But please prioritize and share with us one or two quick thoughts on this very broad question, you know, and then we'll move on to the Q&A portion, if that's all right. And we'll start with you, Tanya. Thank you.
Thanks again, Ben. I feel lucky I get to start, and then I get to take some of the bullet points maybe. One thing I would say in terms of what the UN can do, I think the UN has an important role to play in awareness raising, raising the profile of gender issues relevant to biodiversity and the environmental sphere more broadly. knowledge, you know, I think it's been mentioned already, data is a gap, but just having you know, information that really makes clear the links, articulates well the linkages with clear examples is valuable. And I would say that some of the reports that have been produced already that kind of point to data and point to some clear examples of where women's involvement can make a difference for biodiversity as well as for women's economic empowerment are really significant. One of those is FAO's report on women in agriculture that was about a decade old now, but is still very widely referenced and really brought to light the issue of how increasing women's access to land and reducing barriers for women in agriculture can contribute to overall food security and food production. So that helps make the case. It helps build the rationale, which I think is important in terms of getting more support for this work and getting people on side who are not so familiar with these issues necessarily. So I think that's a role that the UN is well positioned to play. The UN also has a mandate to promote gender. And I think this comes to my second point in terms of the gaps and speaking a little bit to what has been said already and Seemin's point about, you know, the difficulty of even sometimes doing this work together in collaboration within our own institutions. It is a challenging issue to address, particularly with limited resources. But I would say even, you know, in respect to the SDG framework, we know that gender is a kind of, well, is meant to be a critical cross-cutting component of Agenda 2030. But even so, the SDGs that relate to biodiversity, which are 14 and 15, life under water and life on land, don't reflect gender explicitly in the targets. Now, these SDG targets or SDG goals come from the OHCHR biodiversity targets, so we can see the relationship there from the CBD convention. But it's still a different process in which gender was much more at the forefront, and those issues were not reflected in the SDG framework. So I think, you know, this just comes back to the idea that we need to ensure that we are, as a UN system, kind of trying to promote these issues more consistently in our work. And also another big gap, which I'm sure others will speak to more, is just on the area of data and the lack of indicators, which is also something that we are trying to work on and trying to promote in relation to the post-2020 framework and the monitoring framework to have more reflection of sex disaggregated data and looking at how gender can be better reflected in the monitoring of that framework. So I hope that makes some sense, and I will hand it over to the next person. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Tanya. And over to you, Seemin.
Thank you, Ben, and thank you, Tanya, for making those very important points that I will try to build on. I also want to mention that one tool that we do have in our toolbox that may be helpful here in terms of the support that the UN system can give to governments is to advocate for and build the capacity for gender responsive budgeting, so that all of our international normative frameworks, be they the CBD or others, one, are translated into national policies and regulations, and then through gender responsive budgeting to ensure that those national policies and frameworks are actually allocated resources and money so that they can actually be implemented for the benefit of women and girls and their communities. So I think that this is one important area that we can, let's say, strengthen our efforts to support gender responsive budgeting. And this would apply to build the resources and capacities of national statistical offices so that they can adequately and competently collect and analyze and disseminate the sex disaggregated and disaggregated by other important characteristics, data and information that's so important for policy making and decision making. And then I think that another point that I want to build on is how can we ensure that the SDGs are better implemented and tracked at the national level. And Tanya, you've brought up the important issue that we have very few gender responsive indicators for the environment targets under the various SDGs that have to do with biodiversity, climate, and so on. And this is a shortcoming that we as the UN system can work to turn around. And then I just want to close by saying that there is sort of all kinds of alliances and coalitions that we can build so that the UN system is actually working and delivering as one. And this is something that we have to, I think, double and triple our efforts on in the next period. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Seemin. And I'll now invite Gabriela to build on those previous comments and highlight any new or additional.
Yeah, thank you, Ben. Yeah, of course, my bullet points are gone, but just to build on the conversation, one of the things that I find is that a lot of those intergovernment panels and reports that come out, whether on climate or biodiversity, or you look at the living planet, you look at other these kind of global environmental assessments, they often have and these guide a lot of the work that is happening in the environmental sort of arena, but they have very little reference or discussions on gender issues of exclusion or these kind of sort of socio-economic frameworks. And I do find that if I'm thinking as the UN institution or even broader on this, if issues on gender was sort of incorporated already in that sort of, what do you call it, almost theory of change that is provided in these reports, I think it would very much help to guide the sort of the environmental movement. So that is one of the areas that I think is still not really there. The other is to be in the lookout for new approaches. I mean, we hear a lot of that is sort of promoted in environmental projects. Let's take nature-based solutions or payment for ecosystem services. You have a lot of these new approaches, and they initially do not have a strong focus on gender either. And so I think that there is also some work that needs to be done on that level to look at these approaches and mechanisms that people are using or governments are using or institutions are using in their projects and promoting, that we are very cognizant that these also include a strong gender component because they guide a lot of how the project is being designed and the limits. But so I think I'll leave it at there. Yeah, and yes, just one more to reiterate what Tanya was saying. You talk about raising awareness. And there is still, it's not just raising awareness that someone is raising it, is really of building those connections and that, this learning from each other and that we do it at a broader scale. So it's not just someone's raising awareness, but it's really the conversation that needs to be had. And I think that, I'm not saying that raising awareness is not right, but I think that connection, and I think we are still, I think I can't remember who mentioned it, but we're still operating in silos, and the sort of the efforts that goes in addressing gender equality happens at a different place than within the environmental sort of context. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gabriela. Over to you, Flora.
Thank you. And I would just build on actually what Gabriela's just said, because I think there's, and we've talked about this in different spaces, is the need not only to be raising awareness more generally, but also to be giving really concrete case studies and ways in which we can communicate not only the need, but the impact of what happens when you do this well. And so that need for us to be sharing that as broadly and as comprehensively as possible with different types of examples from different regions, from different countries, because context can matter. Another aspect is around the sex disaggregated data. This is not only an issue, this is definitely not only an issue for developing countries. This is an issue that developed countries are finding, that in conversations that we've been having with countries about how they're going to represent their domestic climate, gender responsiveness in their domestic climate plans, there is still a challenge there. And so maybe one of the things that the UN, somehow within the UN system, we could look to having some pilot projects around sex disaggregated data in the context of environment more generally, so that we can then build those case studies and we can see where the actual problem is. Because what we often hear is that there's not the capacity, or that the capacity is limited, but the detail of that and working out what the solutions are can be challenging if you're only doing it as one agency with one country. So one of the things that we are looking at is how we might be able to do that more systematically. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fleur. And now we have a few minutes to answer some of the questions in the Q&A. And I invite the panelists to let me know if there are specific questions they'd like to answer. I'll be directing a couple of them off the bat while you all have an opportunity to think about that. First, Seemin, there was a question here about the links between gender-based violence and the role of women in protecting land and natural resources against extractivism. Seemin, would you be able to address that question briefly?
Thank you, Ben. And this is, I think, an issue that is of huge concern, because we have seen over the past decades and in ongoing struggles that the issue of gender-based violence is a very real one, that women human rights defenders, be they defending their lands and territories, be they defending basically biodiversity and ecosystems against extractivism, are always subject to the risk of gender-based violence. And we have numerous examples of this. And let me just see if I can come up with some figures that that we recently compiled, that when we look at all instances of basically threats to the life and well-being of human rights defenders, more often than not, those that are actually those killings that actually take place have to do with environment-related struggles. So I don't have, how can we prevent this? How can we protect women human rights defenders of the environment? I'm not quite sure what an answer would be to that, but I do know that it's an issue that is being taken up very clearly and strongly in the discussions and negotiations of the right to a healthy environment that are ongoing. And I think that is where we can all join efforts to try to address this really critical and urgent problem. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Seemin. And now I want to ask Tanya a question from the audience about making policymakers accountable for commitments on biodiversity and gender equality. So how do we have a system to make them accountable and promote follow through? Tanya?
Good question. I think that's a challenge for sure. I think one part of it, I would say, is that having strong commitments in place is the first part of that. And that's something that I think we are still trying to develop in respect to gender under the CBD, and that's what part of the aim is of the new gender plan of action, is to kind of make more clear and more measurable types of objectives or actions, or propose those for parties, so that there can be a way of an easier way of monitoring what progress has been made. And on that basis, the countries and the civil society organizations and others working on issues of gender in this context can bring that to the attention of those policymakers, so that it is more obvious what needs to be done, and that there is more kind of pressure, I guess, to undertake that work. So I think that's a big part of it, is establishing commitments and applying the pressure as appropriate. Just trying to think if there's anything else I can say on that, but I think that's part of the work in promoting a gender responsive approach, is to kind of keep bringing it to the forefront and keep ensuring that people are aware and recognize that there is an obligation that's implied in that, and as a result, there is a need to respond. So I don't know if any others have something to add there.
Thanks a lot, Tanya. And what I'll do is I'm going to direct a question to Gabriella and then to Fleur, and then I'm going to invite all of our panelists to make some final remarks where they might choose to address additional questions here in the chat, or their takeaways and reflections. Gabriella, there's a question about how the GEF deals with problems where there's conflicts related to water and mineral, and governments and international corporations have different power and access compared to indigenous peoples and local communities. And the question is, how does GEF deal with a problem when we know there's a power imbalance and a dispute between women and communities and potentially governments or businesses? Over to you, Gabriella.
Wow, that was a detailed question. Let's see if I can try to address that. So maybe the best way for me to address, because I don't know if this was referring to a specific issue, but or not, and I wouldn't be able to answer that. But what we do have is that we have, again, I think it's important to recognize how the GEF operates. We operate with the financial institutions, our implementing agencies are implementing projects on the ground. We, however, have a set of different policies that sets sort of the framework for how these organizations, what kind of processes and policies they need to have in place in order to be able to implement GEF projects. And one of the mostly relevant to this question is probably our updated policy on environmental and social safeguards that provides a framework on how to protect, both in terms of procedures, when, for example, on indigenous peoples with the FPIC process, if there are indigenous peoples in the project area, that a set of procedures needs to be in place in order to ensure the rights of indigenous peoples to participate and to be part of the decision making. We also, and I think this question potentially was a little bit more on a grievance mechanism. We have already, as part of our updated policy on environmental safeguard, improved or requests that all agencies actually have a grievance mechanism related to their projects. So what happens if there is an issue that comes or a conflict, that there should be a grievance mechanism that, you know, any affected parties can raise this issue. And then each of the organizations has, you know, a very elaborated framework on how to address it. And we, as the GF, is informed. And so I think that that is probably the best answer. So each of the projects that are on ground should have a grievance mechanism clearly outlined on the, and all of the agencies have on their website opportunity for stakeholders to raise any concerns of conflicts or emerging conflicts. Hope that answered the question. I'm not totally certain, but.
Thanks a lot, Gabriella. And I think you've done a good job with a difficult and broad question. So I think you've got it. And I'll ask now a question of Flor. Again, from the audience, and maybe I'm going to pick up on a couple of different pieces from questions here in the Q&A. One is about looking for and promoting, I think, promoting synergies between NDCs and conservation efforts, and another about just transition. So, Flora, maybe if you could say a little bit about how you see the synergies between conservation efforts and increasing climate ambition in the context of a just transition. That would be great. Over.
Thank you, and happy to. This goes back to my point about it being a systems issue. The nationally determined contributions are a plan which looks at the whole of an economy. So in some cases, the NDCs will also include the national adaptation plans of a country. And this is where those links come in also to conservation efforts. It goes back to an understanding of what is required in order to address both mitigation and adaptation and resilience for climate change, and that includes conservation. This is an integral element of that. And the aspect of gender in all of this is it also picks up on something that Gabriella has mentioned a couple of times about gender analysis, that it's essential to have that gender analysis at the beginning and have a way of being able to track that throughout the implementation and be able to report on that at the end of that. For just this, included in this, the just transition piece is not separate from, in many ways, it's not separate from other aspects. It's a transition. This is where we need to get to. So it's a process by which we need to get from where we are right now, which is not good for humans or the planet, to where we need to be in terms of climate, but also biodiversity. And so for me, these things are naturally linked, but I understand that's not necessarily the way in which others see that. And part of this is getting us to a point where people can see these linkages more naturally, that these are not separate pieces. These are part of an overall puzzle that we need to put together, and that they're all linked. And that by building the kind of institutional mechanisms and things in one process, it makes it easier, or should make it easier, to then adapt it in the next one.
Great. Thank you very much, Flora, and thanks everybody for the excellent questions. Sorry that we couldn't come to all of them. I'm going to just return to our panel one last time, really ask you to adhere to 1 minute each, and flag, I think, another underlying element that's in a few of these questions, which is relates to addressing gender stereotypes, and including in access to resources and money and other contexts when you do answer. But please feel free to just highlight and focus on whatever you'd like in your concluding remarks. And I'll ask Tanya if she can begin. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ben, and thanks again to everyone. It's been a really interesting discussion, and I see all the questions coming in, and I haven't been able to really absorb all of them to be able to respond. So I know that we are intending to follow up on those after the fact, and I don't have a lot of time. So concluding remarks. I think, you know, a couple, well, quite a number of things have stood out to me, but maybe one, I'm just trying to put together my thoughts more quickly here, is around the importance of gender analysis. Again, like this maybe reflects to the issue that you mentioned of breaking down gender stereotypes, Ben. And I think having a nuanced and kind of rich interpretation of what the underlying issues are, what the norms and standards are in a national or more local context really enables the project or the policy kind of approach to address what the issues are at play, instead of taking a very broad brush and kind of sticking to the very traditional lines of addressing women's vulnerability. I think so. I think what we're talking about here, as has been mentioned, is it's a complex issue that requires investment. It requires dedicated budgeting, monitoring, reporting, but it also requires really thoughtful research and discussion. So I think that's at the heart of this, and I think we all need to be able to get to the point where those of us working in the environmental sphere, as Fleur just mentioned, can understand and also articulate these linkages between gender and the environmental issues underway or at hand more naturally, and that is kind of, I guess, the aim that we are getting to or trying to reach towards. That there is a broader understanding of issues and what needs to be addressed, and with that, the will to do so would presumably follow. So I will leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Tanya. Seemin, any final remarks?
Thank you, Ben. And I'd like to build on Tanya's remarks. When we're thinking about gender stereotypes and discriminatory social norms that affect women and girls in the context of biodiversity, conservation, and sustainable use, I very much agree with Tanya that we have to do everything in our power, be it through gender analysis, be it through mobilization of women's organizations, to overcome the stereotype that underlies much of the thinking and action around gender and biodiversity, which is to look at women and girls as victims and those who are suffering most from the risks and threats and catastrophes that our planet is facing. This may be in some cases true that women and girls are in situations of greater vulnerability and situations of greater risk because of the underlying gender inequalities that all of the panelists and all of the recent reports, global reports and assessments have pointed to. That is what puts women and girls in situations of vulnerability and risk, are those underlying gender inequalities that cut across environment, social, economic, political, cultural, and other factors. But I also want to say something else about gender stereotypes and social norms that can adversely affect women and girls' participation and voice and agency, which is to think that women are stewards of the environment, that women have the specialized knowledge, practices, skills, tools, understanding, relationships, so that they become the saviors of biodiversity and those who are going to lead the fight against biodiversity loss and climate change and land degradation and pollution, etc. We cannot expect women and girls to be the saviors of the planet on their own. Women's unpaid time care work is not elastic. It's not infinite. If women and girls are going to be at the front lines, if they're going to be the biodiversity and climate champions, then they need to be adequately supported, adequately financed, and adequately protected. And that's across the range of their human rights. So that's one thing I really do want to say is, let's not expect women to be the saviors of biodiversity, climate, and the environment. Which, if that means risking their lives and livelihoods, their bodies, their bodily integrity, we cannot have that. So I would just like to ask everyone to keep that in mind. And that's something that UN Women has to keep in mind as well. So it applies to all of us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Seemin. I think a really important point there, and glad you've made it so strongly. I will turn things over to Gabriella now.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ben. It's very hard to follow you there, Seemin, with all of, I mean, I wish that what you were saying would be sort of the end of this conversation. So I feel now a little bit odd of going back to sort of the more less potentially important points. But my little points to conclude is just going back to the draft gender action plan that was pushed as part of this meeting, and that reiterate that the objectives are very well situated. And when we think about the conversation that we have, the three objectives that you put forward, or the overarching goals, are in very well aligned with what we're learning and also part of this conversation. So I'm very happy to see that. But I wanted to add one point that I think we haven't discussed as much. And we talked, and I was very taken by your comments, Seemin, about protecting women's rights and not requesting women to save biodiversity and that. But one of the things we haven't talked so much about, which I think warrants the most additional thought, is really to ensure that investments in the environment benefit women, and that we really are starting to look at what are the income generating activities that really supports women, so that women are not left behind. As you know, if we're hoping and everything goes well, we will have great investments in the environment. We will try to push for a green recovery following the pandemic. But what we cannot allow is that women will not be part of reaping any of these benefits, and that we actually do need to have very clear objectives and priorities to ensure that women actually will benefit, and not benefit equally. They probably have to benefit more because they haven't been benefiting before. And I think that that is one of the things we have to talk about, because we always talk about, you know, equal benefits for men and women. Women have not benefited before. So what we do need is more for women potentially moving forward. And we need to look at their economic and their access to financing, access to resources, you know, credits, markets, all of these issues. I think that it's not going to solve everything, but it's one important steps forward. So thank you very much for me. And it was an honor to be part of this panel, and thank you all for organizing. And thank you all panelists, or all attendants who I can't see. So I can't see who you are or how many you are, but thank you.
Thanks a lot, Gabriella. And I'll now ask Flor if she has a final thought to share with us before inviting the Environment Management Group Secretariat to close the meeting. And thank you, everybody, for staying with us a few extra minutes. They've been really insightful minutes, so I think it's worth it Flora, over to you.
Thank you. And I'm just going to very quickly build on Seemin's point about stereotypes, and what we've talked about very much today is around women and girls and the differentiated impacts. But one of the other things that I think is really important to highlight is that those stereotypes also impact. So stereotypes around masculinity are also things that need to change. So that they're around that are not helpful, around the destructive practices and the seeing of caring for the environment as either unmasculine or feminine, and that being something which can be a barrier to change. So this, when we're talking about gender equality and we're talking about in the context of these things, context matters, and we need to be also addressing those stereotypes that are not only affecting women, but are also impacting men's ability to contribute to these solutions, so that we are not left with a situation in which women are expected to be saving the world. So that these things are actually being done in a way that is equal, and that sharing of the burden is also equal. And I'm going to leave it there.
Thank you so much, Flora. And normally this is when I would invite the audience to give you all a very well-deserved round of applause. Hopefully we'll be doing that again soon. But for now, I'll just turn things over to Nina Arden with the Environment Management Group Secretariat to close things. And thank you again to everybody for joining us. It's been a pleasure to help facilitate this conversation. Over.
Thank you very much, Ben. Thank you, esteemed colleagues, for all of your valued remarks on the intersectionality of gender and biodiversity. Tomorrow we will have a Towards Gender Responsive Biodiversity Action and Outcomes, which is unfortunately a closed workshop. The reason for this is so that we can really dive deep on the next actionable next steps for the collaboration on the implementation of the Gender Plan of Action, and especially hand in hand with the 2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. So the recorded playback, as well as the outcome document, will be uploaded on the EMG landing page for this series. And in the interest of time, we shall also publish a brief Q&A with answers from our panelists to several of your valued questions. So please visit the website in a few days' time. And for now, I wish you and our panelists a productive rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Thank you all again. And looking forward to our next conversation.
Thanks so much, Ben. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.